Welcome to the first episode of our newly launched podcast series entitled Know Thyself, inspired by the famous ancient precept inscribed on the entrance of the Apollo temple in Delphi, and summarizing the essence and the essential orientation of Hellenic philosophy. Know Thyself is a podcast series which aims to explore the interesting, rich, and often challenging and intriguing intersections between academic research, science, inquiry, and self-inquiry, spirituality, meditation, and experiential approaches into the nature of consciousness, embedded and based upon the intimate knowledge and study of our very own minds. This podcast series follows from the recent publication of The Call for a Renaissance of a Spirit in the Humanities, published with and by the Galileo Commission in 2022, where in this call we're inviting scholars from across the humanities and the social sciences to reconsider the very foundations and the worldview axioms upon which our research and work has been focused upon, critically reflect on those axioms, and possibly open up the spaces in our academic and other research in order to include that area of inquiry, which is called knowledge of the nature of mind and consciousness, what traditionally has been often called the spirit, hence the name of the call. So without further ado, in our first episode, we're extremely happy, delighted to be hosting with us Professor Jeff Kripal, who is a J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University in Texas. He's author of the quite famous book called The Flip, Epiphanies of Mind and the Future of Knowledge, and more recently, The Superhumanities, Historical Precedents, Moral Objections, New Realities, published by Chicago University Press. We're very, very happy to have Professor Jeff Kripal with us, where we're going to be talking about the importance that the Delphi precept and that area of knowledge and approach in research and mind that designates has played in his own life and his own academic career and work, as well as we're going to be exploring how he himself, through his own personal journey, stories and histories, has experienced and has imagined the future of academia to be. I'm very happy to have you with us, Jeff. Welcome.
Thank you, Athena. It's an honor to be here.
So we met earlier actually last year, the 23rd of April, 2022, for the presentation of The Call for the Renaissance in the Humanities, where we discussed the state of affairs in the humanities, and we explored how the new paradigm regarding the nature of consciousness is affecting and transforming the way we approach and practice the humanities. And that's where we got to know each other a bit and have a first conversation. So we spoke during the day about the famous Delphic precept, know thyself, around which a while ago, a few centuries ago, the practice of philosophy was structured in ancient Greece. And we spoke a lot about the importance of self-inquiry for philosophy and other humanities areas. And we discussed how that aspect of self-inquiring and the personal, intimate, experiential approach into what is the nature of being in life has been very much neglected for a few centuries now in conventional and mainstream academia. And so I'd like to begin our conversation with asking you, what does this precept, know thyself, mean to you? And is self-inquiry something that you practice, something that, well, obviously has interested you? And how do you approach it? How do you understand it? How do you incorporate that into your work at university?
Yeah. So that's a big question. One speaks and writes where one is. And when you write a book or an essay, the most important question you can ask is, who's the audience? And so I complain a lot. I've reached what I call my crabby phase in life, and I complain about my colleagues and myself a lot, and I complain about the state of the humanities a lot. But it's done out of love and a kind of deep affection for the humanities and for my colleagues, and frankly for myself. I think this principle of knowing thyself is, of course, at the core and origins of Greek and Western philosophy, but it's largely neglected today. We have confused, at least in the States, I'll speak for the States, in philosophy departments, in which I am not, by the way. I am in a department of religion. I don't think the philosophers would have me, frankly, which I think is itself really interesting and really significant. Generally in the States, in philosophy, we are confusing consciousness with cognition. And by that, I mean thought or thinking. And there is no conception of thyself in anything other than the social ego or the cognitive, logical mind. And so the human is reduced essentially to a thinking, logical animal at its best, and certainly at its worst, a kind of dying political animal that keeps making horrible logical mistakes. So it's pretty gloomy, to put it mildly. I'm interested in the history of religions because the history of religions is filled with people who are arguing and being against that. They very much are operating out of a sense of the human as two, as I call it, where there's this social self, there's this egoic identity that is a political and moral social animal, but there's also this deeper kind of cosmic consciousness that exists in the background, as it were, and sometimes manifests itself in mystical experiences or paranormal events. And so that's what I'm most interested in, are those moments when that deeper self or cosmic identity shines through the social self, which doesn't go away, by the way. It is really important to talk about as well. I don't want to dismiss one for the other, but I do want to talk about both. So knowing thyself is, of course, at the core of what I do, but I would just argue that self is two, and not just the social or conscious self that we're aware of.
Great. So you're pointing the distinction between what the ancient Greeks, I guess, would call mind or logistikon, and nous, which is consciousness, or we could say the logical being and the conscious being, the difference between logos and consciousness, or sometimes in other traditions such as Buddhism, they call that normal consciousness or everyday consciousness and wisdom consciousness. And we have very similar terms also in classical Hellenic studies about that. And so what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that we can speak about the self in a relative way, as that kind of personality we have to learn is dependent upon the way we think and interpret things. But then we have that deeper self. And I guess that's what Apollo and Delphi invited us to contemplate upon, which is that wide sense of expansive spaciousness, awareness that we can call consciousness or wisdom consciousness.
Yeah, I sincerely wish that intellectuals understood the intellect as nous, but we generally don't. It's understood in this more logical or rational sense of that which thinks in us. but of course, that which thinks in us is entirely socialized and languaged. I mean, our thoughts are entirely controlled by our societies and our cultures and our languages. And this idea that there's a consciousness that's deeper than thought, I think, is foreign to a lot of critical theory today. Although not always, Athena. There's so many humanists, so many literary critics and philosophers and scholars of religion who are deeply, deeply sympathetic to this doubleness that we've been talking about.
This is the good news. This is the good news.
Yeah, it's very good news. It's what I mean by the superhumanities, that, the humanities have always been the superhumanities. They've always been about these altered states of mind and embodiment. And this is where the big ideas come from, frankly. But it's not where the day-to-day practice is, at least in the States. Again, I can't speak for Europe or Greece, but certainly in the States, philosophy is analytic philosophy. It's how to think rationally and logically. It's not how to access this deeper self, or if you're Buddhist, no self. It's just not that. There's no awareness or no acknowledgement of that.
Which is quite the paradox, because if we visit the Hellenic roots of philosophy, for example, if we go back to Pythagoras or Platonism or Neoplatonism, as we have discussed a couple of times in our correspondence, the idea was that the logical training was just the preparation for the human being to be able to open up into that deeper one, as they call it, the deeper sense of oneness, which is our true nature and our true self. Plotinus is excellent in describing these experiences. We're going to come back now to the flip. I want to ask you about that, because I guess that we can find some descriptions of the flip as early as philosophy can be dated, and Plotinus comes a bit later in that history, but he has some beautiful quotes I've been studying recently. He's Enneads, and he speaks about that oneness that is that's always there, and it's waiting for us to open up to that experience by letting go of all the mental structures and constructs we have. And he calls that our deeper essential self, which in a way is a no self, because it doesn't belong to us, right? And it's a one self. Perhaps that's why the Delphic oracles wrote that inscription at the entrance of the Apollo temple, speaking about oneself and not many selves. So in a sense that there is one nature, one self that we all share. And so we've written this beautiful book called The Flip, where you describe this process of opening up to that super cognitive or that mystery, the Greeks would call it, to that ineffable experience of what is. And you referred to it as the flip. We have other descriptions of that in other languages, such as awakening or witnessing, but you call it the flip, right? So Can I ask you, have you flipped?
Well, yeah, I have actually. Before I talk about that, though, let me say something about Neoplatonism and Plotinus. And then I'll get to the flip. I'll get to my own flip. I'm not avoiding your question. I was trained in the history of religions at the University of Chicago, and one of my teachers was Bernie McGinn, who's sort of the world expert on Christian mysticism. And he used to say that the lingua franca, or the shared language of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim mystics, was Neoplatonism. Mm-hmm. And so I was trained in Neoplatonic thought, through the Christian and Jewish and Muslim mystics, and imbibed it there. I think what I'm saying is it's essentially 21st century Neoplatonism. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I don't want to essentialize what the second or third century Greek philosophers or North African philosophers thought. I mean, they had their own way of being socialized and cultured, but this sense of the nous, I think, is basically identical. So the flip. I don't live in a medieval Christian worldview or a Muslim worldview or a Kabbalistic community. I live in a modern American university, which is filled with scientists and students who want to become doctors, essentially, and engineers, frankly. So it's very much dominated by what in the States we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so when I wrote The Flip, I wrote it out of my pedagogical or teaching experience at my university, working with these young people who wanted to become scientists, essentially. And I started out using religious texts to show them what's possible, these Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, and Buddhist and Hindu texts. And of course, they just brushed them all off as like, well, those people didn't know their science. If they would have known their science, they wouldn't say those crazy things. End of story, end of conversation. So I said, okay, I'm going to show you that your own kind, the people you revere, Nobel laureates and doctors and engineers, had the same sort of experiences. And guess what? It changed how they thought about the world. And so what The Flip is just this little book that's really all about scientists, engineers, and doctors who are trained in some kind of materialist or physicalist worldview in which there's only matter. And they have a flip. They take a psychedelic, or they have a near-death experience, or they just have an experience, and they realize that that's mistaken, that actually consciousness is fundamental and the material world is actually secondary. And what they realize, I think, was something of a surprise, is that their science or engineering or medicine can go on just fine in this new worldview. It doesn't really, that materialism was always just an interpretation of the science. It is not the science. And so that's what The Flip is about. And, to answer your question, yes, I have flipped, but I think I flipped once dramatically in a kind of mystical state living in Calcutta in 1989. But I think the flip was actually very gradual, Athena. I think it was over many decades thinking about these things and realizing that this materialist or physicalist or this social or historical paradigm in which I was trained is actually partial. It's not that it's false. It's perfectly true. It's just that it's not entirely true, and it's not even true in the most important ways. And, I came to this very, very gradually, working with what I would call extreme experiencers and serious humanists and scientists who have thought about these things and kind of followed through on thinking about them. So, yes, to answer your question, yes, I've definitely flipped. Sometimes I think my flip has been a flop. I don't think it's been very successful. I don't think I can reach people very well. And other times it does reach people, and I'm like, oh wow, it worked. It spoke to them. So in that book you're referencing, it's actually a trade book. It's a very public book. It's not an academic book. It's not aimed at other academics. It's aimed at a broad public. So it's trying to reach a lot of people, as opposed to just a few people.
Yeah, which is what we need nowadays to open up
so.
the institutional walls.
I think so.
So how have those experiences, the one very dramatic experience and then perhaps the other smaller tastes or integrations of that bigger experience of flipping or of opening up spiritually, if we might call it that way, how has that affected your life on academic level, professional level? How did it affect your research, the way you approach teaching, the way you approach perhaps your students and the greater institutional framework in which you're found? And if you'd like to share a bit about how perhaps it has influenced your life, your everyday living.
Yeah. So I would say it's made me more playful and more joyful and more humorous. I would use the word humble, but anybody who says they're humble is not being humble.
Yeah. But humorous is a good one, actually. Yeah. A lot of spiritual teachers speak about that one of the features, if you're not laughing, if you're not having a good laugh at all this, something is not going well in your spiritual, let's say, journey.
I always point to, I've been very involved at a in think tank in Big Sur, California called the Esalen Institute. And one year, many years ago, many moons ago, John Cleese, the British comedian, helped us with a fundraiser, and he gave a stand-up there. And I was in the audience. Of course, I heard the whole thing. And this was about 2008 or 9, somewhere in there. And John said something like, what wisdom is when you get to a certain point in life and you realize that nobody knows what they're doing. And, I just heard that. I'm sure I laughed because it was funny. And a few months later, I was at my university and I was sitting in some committee meeting and I was listening to all these colleagues, all these scientists and humanists and social. And I was like, oh my God, we have no idea what we're doing. We're just making this thing up. And it hit me really hard, and it allowed me to be an administrator, frankly, at the university, and not to take myself too seriously, and not to take others too seriously. So when they would come in and yell at me, which they would do a lot, I would just be like, inside, I would be saying, yeah, you're yelling at me, so what? I mean, it's like, yeah, this isn't so serious that you're making it. And I'm not sure anything is serious, actually, including life and death. I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced. So that kind of humor and playfulness, it's not that I stopped being an administrator or a professor. In fact, I do nothing but administration now, basically. I manage people. I deal with people's problems. But there's a kind of lightheartedness or a kind of not taking it too seriously that is at the back of certainly my mind and my heart. And I think it allows me to be a better administrator. And I try to bring that same attitude into my personal life, Athena, with family and friends. And I'm like, yeah, it's going to be a mess. But you know what? It's all okay. And it doesn't matter on one level. The messes are kind of superficial, not kind of, they really are superficial. They really, really are.
Yeah, that's, isn't that the crux of what we call Stoic apathy in a way? Apathy before the Stoics, but in a good sense, that we don't need to suffer from what's happening.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm a Stoic. I don't think I live up to the Stoic ideal, but and I get sucked into things too, like everybody. But
yeah,
on some level, there is a kind of knowing, or there is a kind of playfulness there that does not get sucked in. And
yes.
And I try to communicate this in my writing too. There's a lot of humor in my books, and people do laugh and they comment on it a lot. And I think humor is a kind of mild transcendence, frankly. And if you can laugh at something, what it means is you're not it. You're outside it now. And that's what I think a humanist professor can do at his or her their best. They can help people step outside a worldview and look at it from the outside and see how relative it is. See that it's changing and that it's really constructed. And if it's constructed, it can be deconstructed and reconstructed in a different way. That's this bright message, within the bummer message of the humanities, that everything's constructed.
That's wonderful. I don't know if I'm going to keep that part in the interview, but I spoke to a friend about a week ago, and her mother died. She was suffering from dementia for a few years, but it went really bad in the last about month. So she wasn't recognizing her. She wasn't recognizing anything and anyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my friend is also a seeker. She's in spiritual journey for many years, so she has a different approach and different worldview. But she's certainly the person who embodies that humor and that lightheartedness. So talking about about her mother and the progression of this disease with her, she said to me that during the last weeks, her mother didn't understand anything, but the only time she would engage was when my friend was making jokes. So in a way, the only thing she could understand and laugh was with jokes. And we just had this aha moment, both of us saying, wow, humor transcends the mind. It's like it comes straight from spirit, from consciousness. There is this mild transcendence, as you said. There's something transcendental and very cathartic about humor.
Yeah, I think so. And that doesn't mean we should laugh at everything. I mean, there are really serious moral and political concerns, which I share. I mean, oh my gosh, we could just go on all day there. But it doesn't mean that they're ultimately important. It means that they're temporally or socially important, but not ultimately. And I think that's the distinction we need to draw. I mean, that's the ancient Buddhist distinction. I'm sure it's the ancient Greek distinction. It's a distinction we don't make today, but I think we probably need to.
So I wanted to ask you, how, in your experience, does the materialist worldview affect the way humanities is approached nowadays? So a lot of people do not perhaps understand or are interested in researching a lot around how the greatest scientific paradigm in which we live is affecting non-scientific areas of knowledge, such as the humanities, the arts, and so forth. However, you in your research and us at the Galileo Commission, we're talking a lot about the importance of realizing that this paradigm that arose around the 1800s, scientific materialism, logical reductionism, has really affected and transformed the way we approach the humanities in a way that is disabling the humanities from carrying out what their original telos purpose was. So I don't know if you'd like to say a couple of words about this.
Yeah, first of all, if I can be a kind of a nerd and just think about languages, I mean, they're called the humanities in the States. But in Germany, they're called the Geisteswissenschaften, the sciences of the spirit or the mind, which I think is a way, way better description. In France, unfortunately, they're called the human sciences. And I think that's a mistake, actually. But maybe not. Maybe it's an attempt to sort of redefine the sciences.
Yeah, well, how do we define science, right?
Well, okay. So my basic sensibilities here have been shaped by scientists, by the way, mostly physicists and neuroscientists whom I've worked with closely for almost 2 decades now. And their sensibility is that the sciences are really, really good. The physics in particular is really, really precise about the material or objective physical world out there, whatever that is, but that it doesn't recognize at all subjectivity or consciousness. There's a kind of, science can explain everything except, of course, for us. And that's a big, big hole in the worldview. And unfortunately, that hole is where we exist. And so to the extent that we inhabit a scientific or materialistic worldview, there's only matter, there's only physical stuff out there, and it's all mathematically organized. To the extent we buy that or accept that, it's really very depressing and very devastating to any kind of meaning or any kind of worldview. And so I think that's that deeper sense, that deeper depression is the way that the scientific or materialistic worldview has impacted the humanities, and not just the humanities, but people in general. I think human beings in general, at least in the States, are walking around in a kind of stupor or depression because they really do think on one level that there is only dead matter, and it's just bouncing around in mathematical ways. I know there are lots of people. I know there are lots of religious people who say that's not true, but even they are, I think, persuaded on one level. I think they're believing out of a sense of protest, not really out of a sense of conviction. Even if they say they're convicted, they're really not. I mean, I don't want to speak for them, but I do think it's more complicated than they say. So I think the way beyond this is through this. I don't think you just say we have to ignore the sciences and go on. No, the sciences are really, really good at what they're doing, and the sciences are impacting the religious imagination as well. You know, when people are having near-death experiences, they're not going to a heaven or a hell. They're going into another dimension, or they're talking about the evolution of life. They're integrating Darwin and Newton and Einstein into their religious visions. So I think these are things we have to integrate and have to reimagine, essentially. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's essentially what I think about the sciences. I think that they're actually key to the solution here.
Sure. I have a quote here from the flip that you mentioned, that the materialist interpretation of the world and of science itself is protected not by the facts or by the data of our honest experiences, but by what is essentially social and professional peer pressure, something more akin to the grade school playground or high school prom. The world is preserved through eyes rolling back, snide remarks, arrogant smirks, and subtle or not so subtle social cues, and a kind of professional or conjugal shaming. Right. So I think what you're describing here is something we had discussed during the launch of the call, for instance, the Humanities, as epistemological discrimination or bias. That we live in an era that, for some reason, collective consciousness now has become increasingly sensitive about the issue of discrimination and eliminating boundaries and bias between people, categorizations, and so forth. And it's a bit of a paradox, because we live in an era that opens up inclusion to almost anything. We've become way more flexible in terms of our understanding of inclusion of different genders, sexes, of course, and gladly there is more ethnic equality in our times, and we're more sensitive to the importance of bringing down structures of discrimination. Yet at the same time, there are other forms of discrimination, perhaps subtler forms of discrimination, that are still very predominant in our societies. And we discussed those that exist within universities and within areas of knowing between the academic institution. And we spoke about this epistemological bias or discrimination that happens against certain researchers and professors and teachers and thinkers on the basis of the worldview, and how those forms of discrimination are not sustained by true arguments, but really by social dynamics. And I think that's what you're pointing out to in this passage. Would you like to comment a bit about this issue of discrimination against alternative worldviews and ways of approaching and practicing the humanities? And if you'd like to share any of your own personal experiences and challenges around that area.
Yeah. So this is why I wrote the Super Humanities, by the way. It answers that series of questions in a pretty extensive way. The subtitle is Historical Precedents, Moral Objections, and New Realities. And essentially, what I argue is that the emphasis on sex, gender, race, and class is entirely appropriate and devastatingly convincing. Particularly in the States. I mean, the U.S. was formed by 250 years of enslaving other human beings. The economy was built on racism and still is structurally racist in a really fundamental way. When I studied the history of religions, my early interests were gender and sexuality. And what I concluded was that the religions themselves are inherently misogynist and patriarchal, and that they expel male heterosexuality, by the way, not other forms of sexuality, but in particular male heterosexuality. And so I think all of these critiques are entirely just and correct. And the diversity that you spoke of is, I think, a function of these critiques. I think young people today don't even think about gender or sexual diversity because, frankly, my generation suffered for those things. We suffered intensely. My early work was the target of Hindu fundamentalists and nationalists along exactly these lines. So we were suffering in the 80s and 90s to break open this box around sexual orientation and gender diversity. And today that's just assumed, but young people, I think, often don't understand how the older generation suffered for this. So I think all of that is key, and without apology, I think we should do that. I also think we need to take that diversity further, and we need to talk about ontological diversity. And this is where you were going with your question. I don't think it's only a matter of sexual or gender or racial diversity. I think it's also a matter of ontological diversity and understanding that other cultures and peoples actually experience the world in different ways, and that the world might be differently than our modern scientific materialism suggests it is. And that's where I think we should go now. I think we should push the diversity thing further, not pull back, push it further and say, hey, look, this is weirder than we thought. And so to me, that's really empowering and really faithful to what the Humanist Academy has been up to. That's not where the Humanist Academy is, Athena. I mean, I think that's also behind your question. I mean, I would say there's more support for this than we imagine. Again, when I always get the question, how do you deal with pushback? And my response is always, what pushback? I lecture on these things at universities in Europe and the States all the time. I'm an associate dean in a dean's office. I work at a major research university. There's a lot of support for this. And most intellectuals, including a lot of scientists, by the way, are deeply sympathetic. They're basically in the closet, to use a sexual metaphor.
Yes, that's the one we use very often.
They won't step out of the closet and say it themselves because they're afraid. And this gets to your question about social pressure. They really are afraid for professional reasons. They won't get the grant, or they won't get promoted. I mean, these are real disciplinary measures. On the other hand, they're very sympathetic personally because their mothers or their brothers or themselves have had these experiences. They know darn well they happen. And so when someone like myself walks into their university and just starts talking about it, they're like, oh, wow, you should do that, Jeff. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say those things, but you should say them. So
exactly. And that's what I'm talking about. Exactly. So there is an institutional there's a structural bias. There's a structural constraint to being able to be open about those experiences and approach the humanities through this alternative cultural way.
And basically,
call it alternative because it's very ancient, really. But,
and basically, the politics of knowledge here is that the more established your discipline is, the less you can say. So,
and why is that? Why do you think is that? Why is that?
It's a social thing. It's the way the order of knowledge is controlled and maintained. So physicists can actually say the least. Physicists and chemists are pretty much silenced. But humanists can say a lot more. And by the way, scholars of religion can say a lot precisely because we have no status. And we're way down on the pecking. We're so far down we're below the screen, Athena. And because we're not supposed to know anything, we can say anything. And so I think you get a lot of this stuff from scholars of religion, frankly, but also anthropologists, also literary critics. You get it from people who inhabit the margins of the order of knowledge and are trying to impact the order of knowledge from outside in. So, for example, ancient Greek philosophy, I mean, I know some scholars of ancient Greek philosophy, but they, again, inhabit the margins of American philosophy. They don't inhabit the center. And I happen to agree with them. I think they're just right about things. But they're right from the margins. They're not right from the center. So there's something about the center or the order of knowledge itself that I think we need to struggle with. And we need to explain why our colleagues, why smart people don't accept these things. They're not doing that because they're sinister, Athena. They're not doing that out of dishonesty. They really, really think that. It's simply not part of their experience. So I think we have to struggle with the esoteric nature of what we're saying. And by esoteric, I do not mean a secret that I could whisper to you or whisper to anyone and then they know it. I mean a form of knowledge that most people cannot inhabit. It's not that they won't, it's that they cannot. And I think that's foreign to our order of knowledge as well. We want to assume, we think of knowledge as like an empty bucket and you just fill it up with water until it's full and then you walk out of the university. And I'm like, no. That's actually not how it works. You transform a human being and the being of the human knows something differently because the being is different. Mm-hmm. Well, that's very Greek, but it's not academic today. It's foreign to the transactional, data-driven nature of knowledge that people assume, I think, today.
Exactly. So why do you think that people cannot approach that? Is it that they cannot approach it because of an ontological reason, or is it precisely because we live in an era that is so dominated by a different narrative of who we are, what we are, the world we live in, right? We already are born and socialized within an understanding of materialism. Do you think that can be one of the reasons why there is this resistance or inability of people to approach the humanities or those ideas in a more holistic way? But even the science, it's not just the humanities, because we do have also, and gladly so, this wave of scientists, this through the IONS, Galileo Commission, Scientific and Medical Network, those scientists that are arguing for those ideas and are actually researching and bringing evidence to support this post-materialist understanding of ontology. So do you think that there are ontological constraints in that, or is it mainly social constraints and socialization constraints?
So I think the social or the cultural runs much deeper than we imagine. I think we perceive the world and experience the world because of our cultures and our languages. It's not that we can... I don't trust my senses, Athena. I don't think you should either. I think your senses are controlled by your culture. And I think we experience the world in the ways that our culture tells us to experience it. Mm-hmm. I'm a bit more skeptical about the ability of people to break out of that socialization. I think a lot of people are very optimistic and they think all we need to do is tip the thing and the science will get us there and everything will be great. I'm not so sure. And the reason I'm not so sure is because of the history of religions and a lot of wisdom figures who basically were killed. and who were very clear that what they were saying could not be heard by their own people. I think we probably idolize ancient Greek society. I mean, we read Plato and Aristotle and a little Pythagoras, but we don't really struggle with the fact that Greek society killed Socrates. They killed him.
Yeah, it's a different Greek society, and Greek philosophers are not the same thing. They're two different.
And it's the same with early Christianity, frankly. I mean, if you really read the Gospels, what you realize is that the parables were designed to put people off and to confuse people, and that there was a secret. And Jesus was not going to tell the secret to just anyone. He was only going to tell it to his inner circle of disciples. So, I mean, we keep imagining that knowledge is somehow accessible to everyone and that everyone can know everything. We think of knowledge as a bucket, again, that we're going to fill up water. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And so that doesn't mean I'm a pessimist, Athena. I'm not. But I think we have to struggle with that. And any model we develop of knowledge has to explain why people don't accept this or don't know this, and not just why they do.
Is it important to incorporate self-inquiry, meditation,
Absolutely,
alternative ways of engaging with knowing the universe, knowing ourselves in academia? And if so, how would you structure, let's say, a philosophy course or an introduction to religion and spirituality course at a university level that would be different and could appeal to younger generations of scholars in a different way?
Again, that's what the Super Humanities as a book is all about. Mm-hmm. It's what I call both and thinking. It's not that you just do the social and the historical and the political, or you just do the spiritual and the mystical and the metaphysical. You do both at the same time, or you do them in serial order. So, for example, in my course on comparing religions, there's a ton in there on how all these traditions are socially constructed. There's a ton on sex and gender and race and class and everything. But there's also a ton on metaphysical revelations and the idea that the human is two. And so it's both, Athena. That's what I want to say. It's not one or the other. And I think the way that we transform education is that we actually do both, and we show young people that both are true. They don't have to choose between one or the other. Because I think sometimes we talk in a way that the message people get is you do have to choose, and you don't. And the reason you don't have to choose is because you really are both. It's not even a choice. It's just that's what a human being is.
Exactly. I totally agree with you, and I think that is what philosophy is: a science in the sense of a rigorous study and experiential, embodied practices, meditation practices to know ourselves at the same time, and that's the beauty of it. That's the spiritual richness of it. Yes.
Yeah. The logic and the analytical philosophy is really important, but so is the Neoplatonism and the nous. I mean, they're both so do them both. Don't do one or the other.
For example, the way they taught ancient philosophy incorporated a lot of spiritual practices. So, for example, they started with meditation and prayer and incense and all that. It was like a ritual. They were calling the dialectics philosophical rituals, and then they would move on to the conceptual analysis, to the rigorous explanation, to the arguments, right? Then there would be some transmission energetically, then back into discussion, then, right, again, kind of a meditation embodied practices. It's wonderful to be able to hold spaces like that where we can marry the two aspects, but that would be considered completely unorthodox.
The example that I keep thinking of is Einstein, actually, who was writing, I think he was writing about Parmenides. We say Parmenides in English. I don't know what it is in Greek. I'm sure it's
Parmenides.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not Parmenides. But, Einstein was saying something really ignorant, like, well, he thought everything was thinking. And of course, he was mistranslating nous, I'm sure. He
What
thought
was he saying? Sorry,
that everything is thought, or everything is thinking. And Einstein was just, but my point is that there's a fundamental mistranslation there again, because Einstein was thinking that thinking is all there is, and Parmenides was saying, no, there's this sort of, there's nous, or this fundamental mind behind it all. And I think that's what gets erased, in our modern day world, the way that Einstein erased it, and the way you're not erasing it. You, it seems to me, are foregrounding it.
Is there any advice you'd like to give younger generations of scholars that perhaps are interested in meditation, spirituality, and they're trying to find a way in universities and trying to see, hey, can I fit here? Can I pursue a career in academia? Do I have to be in the closet all my life and send anonymous essays into unorthodox publications? We had that instance happening with the publication. You were part of it, and you were not anonymous, in the Spiritual Awakenings book by Dave Lorimer and Marjorie Willacott. So we still got some anonymous essays because people said, I'm really sorry, I cannot put my name. That's going to jeopardize my status at university.
Right.
In an era of liberalism and freedom of thought.
So, first of all, I do mentor and advise young people. That's what I do for a living. And I also train PhD students who will become professors. And I always use an American myth to train them, Superman. And what I say is, Superman never gets a job. Only Clark Kent gets a job. And it's a pretty boring job, but it's a job. And I say to these people, look, I know you're Superman or Superwoman or superhuman, but you got to learn how to go to the Daily Planet and write the things that the Daily Planet wants you to write. And these skills we're going to teach you, these skills of reflexivity and critical thinking and how to write and communicate, they're not tangential. They're really good things to know how to do. So learn how to be Clark Kent, but also acknowledge that there's a Superman inside Clark Kent, or that the real identity of Clark Kent is Superman, and Clark Kent's a bad, all he does is put on glasses and put a suit on and walk into the day. I mean, it's a really bad disguise. But you really have this superhuman self behind you that's more real than the Clark Kent social ego. But you need to be both. And if you're going to get a job, let's get you a job as Clark Kent. And then when you get a job, then let the Superman come out.
But, so I'm going to question you on this one. Why do we have to play a role that we're not? If we're not really that, why do we have to play a role? And we spoke about the divided life during the launch, right? And how we have been brought into thinking that we need to have a divided life, or Superman self, or let's say deeper understanding of ourselves, a spiritual inquiry, and then our academic life. Why couldn't we integrate them?
Well, I am arguing for integration, Athena, but also an acknowledgement that they're different, and of course it depends on your society and your social situation. But in most social situations, there really is a kind of two-ness here. And I'm not sure that two-ness always can be integrated, I guess is what I'm trying to say. A lot of the history of religions is about asceticism and leaving the world. There's no integration. And so I think historically human beings have not integrated those two levels. And I'm not saying they cannot be integrated. I'm just saying that historically they have not been. And we need to keep experimenting with that to try to integrate them.
For instance, ancient schools of philosophy, Platonic schools, Pythagorean schools, there were integrations. People's lives were that. They didn't have to be an extra role. They were philosophers. They didn't need to be something else.
Right, but they probably didn't have families or children, or they probably didn't go to work. And modern society is very different than ancient Greek society, and that's all I'm saying. Is just you have to exist in a particular society.
I completely understand, and I'm grateful that you're sharing it. I'm just pushing you a bit here because we are talking about reimagining universities, right? There is a possibility of reimagining the way we approach the humanities. There is a possibility of change.
Yeah, and of course that's what I do. I want more Superman in the academy, and I want Clark Kent to still be there, but I want Superman there too. So I'm pushing for a kind of integration as well. It's just maybe a different kind.
Okay, that's great. So one last thing: do you have a lot of students? Do you meet students and colleagues that are more and more interested in the more meditational, experiential, and embodied aspects of philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, that's what I do. So you tend to attract, the people who read you, and they come to you because they want to study what you are interested in and what you're trying to argue for. But I do think the younger generation is at a different place than certainly my generation or the generation ahead of me. I really do.
Yeah, and as you said, it's greatly because of the work that your generation did in many respects, and the things that you had to struggle through that we may take as granted right now.
Yeah, I think so. I think people think that the given is the given, but it's not given. It was suffered for, trust me. And the people before us suffered for other things. I mean, I'm not romanticizing my generation. I'm saying it's a process. Exactly. It's an intergenerational process, and every generation is temporary, but every future generation depends on the generations that came before them in a really fundamental way.
Exactly. And that's why it's very important to not just think about our generations and think about what we're building for the future and what we're leaving for next generations to come.
It's also, by the way, why I so believe in books. Because a book can speak to people all over the world 24 hours a day, even when the author's asleep, but also when the author's dead. I mean, books never go away. They just keep working their magic, year after year, generation after generation. So I really do believe in the magical, transformative quality of books. They're not just books. There's something else.
That's very, very nice. Yeah, there's something very powerful about.
I mean, you're reading lecture notes that were written 1800 years ago, right? I mean, come on. Plotinus is speaking to you, and he's been not with us in physical form for 18 centuries.
And it's like their meaning also evolves. It takes on a different life, a life of itself. The text acquires a life of itself and moves forward with time. Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah. It's magical. Great. Thank you so much for
Athena.
your time. It was wonderful to speak to you. And I have to say that it's very fortunate that you exist and you're where you're at. And as you said, you can attract people so people can come to you if they want to pursue a more holistic, a more open-minded, a more spherical, we would say in Greek, right? Spherical, round approach to philosophy, spirituality, religion. So thank you very much for the work you do.
Yeah,
you do pave the way for us younger scholars.
We'll keep trying. But you're going to have to do this thing. I think I'm too old to do it, but you're going to see things that we won't. My generation won't.
And I really feel that there's this change brewing. I can feel it in the collective kind of stream. There's this change brewing. So it's only in our minds to allow it to happen. We live in revolutionary times.
Yeah. Well, thought tends to produce itself. So there are good reasons to be a pessimist, but they'll result in bad scenarios. And there maybe are not so good reasons to be an optimist, but they'll result in very good scenarios. So it actually makes some sense. It makes better sense to be an optimist than a pessimist, I think.
Thank you so much for your time. It's always inspiring to talk to you. And thank you for your work and everything you do.
Thanks, Athena. Thanks for having me.
Ζευ πάτερ, πίσον έθριν, δώσ' δε φως ιδέσθε, ή να πάυσει πλέον σφαγισμένη η τλίμων αλήθεια.